especially about the voice of that unbearable pedlar, which went on in a monotonous and maddening sing-song. "We'll wash out grease stains, mud stains, blood stains," until Sikes fled almost screaming. For this boyish mixture of appetite and repugnance there is a good popular phrase, supping on horrors. Dickens supped on horrors as he supped on Christmas pudding. He supped on horrors because he was an optimist and could sup on anything. There was no saner or simpler schoolboy than Traddles, who covered all his books with skeletons. Oliver Twist had begun in Bentley's Miscellany, which Dickens edited in 1837. It was interrupted by a blow that for the moment broke the author's spirit and seems to have broken his heart. His wife's sister, Mary Hogarth, died suddenly. To Dickens, his wife's family seems to have been like his own. His affections were heavily committed to the sisters, and of this one he was peculiarly fond. All his life, through much conceit and sometimes something bordering on selfishness, we can feel the redeeming note of an almost tragic tenderness. He was a man who could really have died of love or sorrow. He took up the work of Oliver Twist again later in the year, and finished it at the end of 1838. His work was incessant and almost bewildering. In 1838 he had already brought out the first number of Nicholas Nickleby, but the great popularity went booming on. The whole world was roaring for books by Dickens, and more books by Dickens, and Dickens was labouring night and day like a factory. Among other things, he edited the Memoirs of Grimaldi. The incident is only worth mentioning for the sake of one more example of the silly ease with which Dickens was drawn by criticism, and the clever ease with which he managed in these small squabbles to defend himself. Someone mildly suggested that, after all, Dickens had never known Grimaldi. Dickens was down on him like a thunderbolt, sardonically asking how close an intimacy Lord Braybrooke had with Mr. Samuel Pepys. Nicholas Nickleby is the most typical, perhaps, of the tone of his earlier works. It is in form a very rambling, old-fashioned romance, the kind of romance in which the hero is only a convenience for the frustration of the villain. Nicholas is what is called in theatricals a stick, but any stick is good enough to beat a squeers with. That strong thwack, that simplified energy, is the whole object of such a story, and the whole of this tale is full of a kind of highly picturesque platitude. The wicked aristocrats, Sir Mulberry Hawk, Lord Verisopht, and the rest, are inadequate versions of the fashionable profligate. But this is not, as some suppose, because Dickens in his vulgarity could not comprehend the refinement of patrician vice. There is no idea more vulgar or more ignorant than the notion that a gentleman is generally what is called refined. The error of the Hawke conception is that, if anything, he is too refined. Real aristocratic blackguards do not swagger and rant so well. A real fast baronet would not have defied Nicholas in the tavern with so much oratorical dignity. A real fast baronet would probably have been choked with apoplectic embarrassment and said nothing at all. But Dickens read into this aristocracy a grandiloquence and a natural poetry which, like all melodrama, is really the precious jewel of the poor. But the book contains something which is much more Dickensian. It is exquisitely characteristic of Dickens that the truly great achievement of the story is the person who delays the story. Mrs. Nickleby, with her beautiful mazes of memory, does her best to prevent the story of Nicholas Nickleby from being told, and she does well. There is no particular necessity that we should know what happens to Madeline Bray. There is a desperate and crying necessity that we should know Mrs. Nickleby once had a footboy who had a wart on his nose and a driver who had a green shade over his left eye. If Mrs. Nickleby is a fool, she is one of those fools who are wiser than the world. She stands for a great truth that we must not forget, the truth that experience is not in real life a saddening thing at all. The people who have had misfortunes are generally the people who love to talk about them. Experience is really one of the gaieties of old age, one of its dissipations. Mere memory becomes a kind of debauch. Experience may be disheartening to those who are foolish enough to try and coordinate it, and to draw deductions from it, but to those happy souls like Mrs. Nickleby, to whom relevancy is nothing, the whole of their past life is like an inexhaustible fairyland. Just as we take a rambling walk because we know that a whole district is beautiful, so they indulge a rambling mind because they know that a whole existence is interesting. A boy does not plunge into his future more romantically and at random than they plunge into their past. Another gleam in this book is Mr. Mantalini. Of him, as of all the really great comic characters of Dickens, it is impossible to speak with any critical adequacy. Perfect absurdity is a direct thing, like physical pain or a strong smell. A joke is a fact, however indefensible it is. It cannot be attacked. However defensible it is, it cannot be defended. That Mr. Mantalini should say in praising the outline of his wife, "The two countesses had no outlines, and the dowager's was a damned outline," this can only be called an unanswerable absurdity. You may try to analyse it, as Charles Lamb did the indefensible joke about the hair. You may dwell for a moment on the dark distinctions between the negative disqualification of the Countess and the positive disqualification of the Dowager, but you will not capture the violent beauty of it in any way. She will be a lovely widow. I shall be a body. Some handsome women will cry. She will laugh damnably. This vision of demoniac heartlessness has the same defiant finality. I mention the matter here, but it has to be remembered, in connection with all the comic masterpieces of Dickens, Dickens has greatly suffered with the critics precisely through this stunning simplicity in his best work. The critic is called upon to describe his sensations while enjoying Mantalini and Micawber, and he can no more describe them than he can describe a blow in the face. Thus Dickens, in this self-conscious, analytical, and descriptive age, loses both ways. He is doubly unfitted for the best modern criticism. His bad work is below that criticism. His good work is above it. But gigantic as were Dickens's labours, gigantic as were the exactions from him, his own plans were more gigantic still. He had the type of mind that wishes to do every kind of work at once, to do everybody's work as well as its own. There floated before him a vision of a monstrous magazine entirely written by himself. It is true that when this scheme came to be discussed, he suggested that other pens might be occasionally employed, but reading between the lines it is sufficiently evident that he thought of the thing as a kind of vast multiplication of himself, with Dickens as editor opening letters, Dickens as leader-writer writing leaders, Dickens as reporter reporting meetings, Dickens as reviewer reviewing books, Dickens, for all I know, as office-boy opening and shutting doors. This serial, of which he spoke to Messrs. Chapman and Hall, began and broke off, and remains as a colossal fragment bound together under the title of Master Humphrey's Clock. One characteristic thing he wished to have in the periodical. He suggested an Arabian Nights of London, in which the Gog and Magog, the giants of the city, should give forth chronicles as enormous as themselves. He had a taste for these schemes or frameworks for many tales. He made and abandoned many he half fulfilled. I strongly suspect that he meant Major Jackman in Mrs. Lirriper's Lodgings and Mrs. Lirriper's Legacy to start a series of studies of that lady's lodgers, a kind of history of No. 81 Norfolk Street, Strand. The 7 Poor Travellers was planned for 7 stories, we will not say 7 poor stories. Dickens had meant, probably, to write a tale for each article of somebody's luggage. He only got as far as the hat and the boots. This gigantesque scale of literary architecture, huge and yet curiously cosy, is characteristic of his spirit, fond of size and yet fond of comfort. He liked to have story within story, like room within room of some labyrinthine but comfortable castle. In this spirit he wished Master Humphrey's Clock to begin, and to be a big frame or bookcase for numberless novels. The clock started, but the clock stopped. In the prologue by Master Humphrey reappear Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller, and of that resurrection many things have been said